Before we get into today's story, let's take a detour to Gaffney, South Carolina, back in the 1960s. Back then, the hum of the textile mills still filled the air, and folks worked long shifts under looms and spindles. Mill life was tough, long hours, low wages, and a meal might be nothing more than some potted meat and crackers at lunch, with beans and fatback for supper. But even in the hardest times, folks found ways to sweeten life just a little. And that's where sweet potato pone came in. Grated sweet potatoes, molasses, warm spices, and baked up just right. It was a dish that reminded folks there was still a little good to be had, even when times were tough. But Gaffney in the 60s wasn't just a town of mill workers and home-cooked meals. It was a place on the edge of change. Civil rights were reshaping the South, rock and roll was taking over the jukeboxes, and teenagers were drag racing down Limestone Street while their parents were sipping coffee in the cafe. But beneath all that, there was something dark happening that folks wouldn't forget, no matter how hard they tried. Just like that sweet potato pone, today's story has layers, something warm, something dark, and by the end, it'll leave you with something to chew on. So settle in.
I'm Darlene.
And I'm Melody.
This is Hard Times and True Crimes. Do we have any shout outs?
Yes, we want to shout out Juanita. She bought us 4 coffees this week.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Juanita, for supporting the show. And she's also submitted a few suggested episodes for us to look into.
Ooh.
So, yeah, thank you, Juanita.
Yes. We're both ready for spring.
Yes.
I think even I'm ready for spring. I don't want it to get hot, but I'm ready for it not to be cold.
I want it to get hot.
I hate it. I hate hot weather.
Yeah. I've tried to really adopt your attitude over the winter of, just embracing the coziness.
Yes.
But I'm officially over it.
I do love being cozy. Hey, just want to let you guys know that we're going to have some t-shirts coming up for sale in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eyes peeled. We're really proud of them.
They look great.
Yeah, they do. On May 20th in 1967, a married couple, 32-year-old Annie and her husband, 25-year-old Roger Dedman, hopped into their car and made the 30-minute drive from where they lived in Spindale, North Carolina, over to South Carolina, just outside Gaffney, for a night out. The Dedmans had only been married for about 2 years, and let's just say it had not exactly been smooth sailing for the two of them. Their marriage was rocky. Annie drank, Roger drank, and there was talk that he might have been dabbling in some prescription drugs. She had already been married and had 3 kids from her previous marriage. And then she and Roger had a 15-month-old son together. It was a lot of responsibility for a couple who's already struggling.
Yeah.
On this particular night, both of them wanted to party. Annie's 13-year-old daughter, Jeanette, stayed home and babysat Roger Jr. Annie's older kids were staying with some of her family. And so the two of them, they had a night free to kind of let loose and do whatever they wanted to do. You were just saying you and your husband took a night and went over to Greensboro?
Yes.
And stayed the night in a hotel?
We did at the Four Seasons, and it was a much-needed break. I can relate to Annie.
So...
Well, wait, she was ready for a night out on the town. We didn't go out a night out on the town.
Y'all were going for a night in.
Yes.
Annie had her heart set on going to a Cherokee County bar called the Highway 18 restaurant. For whatever reason, though, Roger, he did not want to go there. He wanted to go to a different place. And so they kind of went back and forth arguing about it. But like a lot of their arguments, it didn't really last that long. And Annie, she won that one. Roger finally agreed to take her. A friend of Annie's, Peggy Hodges, went along for the ride with them. Peggy was from Rutherford County, and she was out also to have a good time. And y'all know how it goes when couples are drinking. Things can get out of hand, heated real quick. For whatever reason, Annie, she starts dancing with other men
Oh, that's
in the bar.
Not going to end well.
No, right in front of her husband. And of course, this infuriates him. And before long, they're going at it. He told her he hoped she was enjoying herself because that was going to be the last night she'd ever spend there. And Annie shot right back and told him she was done, that she was leaving. And he said, well, you can leave if you want to, but you're not taking the baby. So one of those fights.
Yeah.
Both of them were causing a big scene in the middle of the bar. It got so out of hand that Annie ended up cussing him out, slapping him, kicking him, and he wound up with scratches on his face. Yeah. And then just like that, they both kind of cooled down and even seemed to patch things up and start to have a good time together again.
So that may have been a pattern with them.
Yeah, they had a kind of a volatile relationship for sure. They had a couple more drinks, but eventually they called it a night at around 11:30. Everybody in the bar probably clapped when they walked out. The friend of Annie's, Peggy, she ended up catching a ride home with somebody else, and I don't blame her. I wouldn't have wanted to ride home with those two. Annie drove because Roger had been taking shots all night. She stuck to the back roads because, there wasn't much traffic. She'd been drinking a little bit herself.
Yeah, I was going to say she was probably intoxicated, just not as much as him.
Right, exactly. But the few folks who were out on the roads that night would later remember seeing their car swerving all over the place. So whether it was because they were still arguing or because she was drunk, who knows? The couple did argue a little more in the car before they stopped at the grill in Gaffney, where Roger ran inside for some coffee and a couple of donuts. When he came back out to the car, Annie was gone. She wasn't in her car, and she was nowhere else in sight. And as crazy as it sounds, this actually was not the first time they'd gotten into it, and Annie had taken off on foot.
Oh, okay.
Now, you have to think this is the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of hitchhiking going on back then. And, people they walked around without fear, unlike us today. Roger figured that Annie had needed some time to cool down, and maybe some of their friends had drove by, and she went with them kind of to spite him. So instead of looking for her, he just drove home, drunk as a skunk, figuring she'd come walking in a few hours once she'd blown off some steam. But instead of Annie coming home like Roger expected, the police would knock on his door early that morning. Annie was not blowing off steam. She wasn't at a friend's house. Her nude body had been found, dumped and sprawled out off of the highway between Union County, South Carolina, and Spindale, North Carolina. She'd been raped and strangled to death. Her lifeless body was left propped up against a chain-link fence next to an electrical transformer on Jerusalem Road in Union County.
And I'm sure he was prime suspect, or no?
Oh,
Not
yeah.
yet.
Well,
okay,
it's going to get that way quick.
Because it usually does.
Of course.
Yeah.
So Annie Lucille Dedman was born Annie Haynes on February 17th, my birthday,
Yeah.
in 1934. She was the youngest of 4 children born to William and Laura Haynes in North Carolina. Being the baby of the family, she was probably a little bit spoiled, but growing up in a poor Southern family, it wasn't always easy. No matter how loved she was, life was kind of hard. And I don't know a whole lot about Annie's childhood or early adult years. There's just not much out there. But what I do know is that by the time she was 30, she was divorced and had her 3 children by herself to raise. When she met Roger, she was a single mother, juggling a lot of responsibility and trying to make things work, the best way she could. Roger and Annie were dating when he was a 21-year-old GI, and Annie was 7 years older than him. All of a sudden, he got these orders that he was being deployed overseas to fight in Vietnam. And you know how that kind of news, it can hit you, and it can either make you reflective and calm, or it can cause you to be impulsive. And for Roger and Annie, they ran straight to the church house and got married on a whim.
I bet they're not the first people to have done that when those papers called them up.
Oh, yeah. And probably because, you're facing the uncertainty of war, and, sometimes you just go with what feels right in moments like that. Not that they didn't care about each other or that there wasn't any love there, but marriage hadn't ever really been in the plans.
Yeah.
And not yet anyway.
Kind of just hastened things up a little bit.
Right. But at first, they were head over heels in love and dreamed about their futures together. But then Roger, he had to go. 2 sources I found say that while he was off fighting in Vietnam, Annie was hanging out at a truck stop in Gaffney, making money that way.
Uh-oh.
If you catch my drift.
I do catch your drift.
Now, whether she was just struggling to get by or had other reasons for being there, I really don't know. Supposedly, Roger found out about it, but decided to stay with her. When he came back home, he landed a good paying job and hoped the stability of that steady paycheck would maybe be enough to fix their relationship. But money rarely fixes much of anything.
Mm-mm.
On top of all that, Roger wasn't really winning any Stepfather of the Year awards. He might have wanted to build a better life with her, but when it came to her kids, he just wasn't great to them.
Oh, I hate that.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's indifference or frustration or selfishness, he just never really stepped up into that father role the way she probably hoped he would.
And in the way those kids needed him too, I'm sure.
Right.
I mean, it sounds like their life with their mom was already unstable enough.
Yeah.
So I just hate that now she brought another man into this picture and he's not really that great.
Right.
Wants her, but not them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's young.
Oh, well, that's true.
He's
you did say he was
real young.
21.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, for all their problems, genuinely, they really did enjoy each other's company. When things were good, you know, they had a lot of fun together. They laughed a lot and just seemed to really like being around each other. If that was all life was about, their relationship would have been great. In 1966, Annie gave birth to little Roger Jr., and just like that, their family grew even bigger. Roger adored his little son. That was his first baby, and he was a proud papa for sure.
And his namesake.
You're right. But now the couple was raising 4 children that ranged from the ages of 13 all the way down to 1. And, you know, that's a lot of responsibility for a couple that's already struggling, and a man who'd gone from being a single, he was 25, so 25-year-old, to an almost instant family of 6.
Oh, yeah.
So in their relationship, by this point, trust was broken, their family dynamic was strained, and some of Annie's family said that she was planning to leave Roger when school let out for the summer. So the couple had argued the day of the murder because Roger had learned that Annie had been drinking all day while he was at work at a textile mill over in Shelby, North Carolina, when she was supposed to be taking care of the baby. When her body was found, it did not take long for Roger to become the prime suspect. And honestly, I mean, I can see why.
Yeah, you know, doesn't look good for him.
It doesn't. He and Annie had been fighting. People saw them arguing at the bar. In fact, she had tried to take off in his car, and he had to basically drag her out of the car.
Oh, gosh.
I mean, yeah.
And I'm thinking of those scratches you said he got on his face. Did other people see her make those scratches when they fought at the bar?
I don't know.
Okay.
And let's not forget, he literally told her that that was going to be her last night there.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes words uttered in haste, in anger, can really come back to bite you in the butt.
They sure can. So Roger was charged with his wife's murder, even though the evidence was pretty flimsy. Well, I won't say it was flimsy. I will say it was purely circumstantial because, you know, there were no eyewitnesses to the murder, no physical proof tying him to the crime scene. But to the police, it was kind of a simple case of a jealous, drunk husband who gets into a fight with his wife and she winds up dead. And he's the last person to be seen with her.
Yeah.
The case against Roger got even stronger when an officer testified that Roger had confessed to killing his wife. According to him, they even offered to get him a lawyer, but Roger told them that he didn't want one, that he was ready to confess and cooperate with law enforcement. And it wasn't just the police that said this. Annie's mother said that he had also confessed to her brother. and told him that he was afraid he had killed Annie, but that he had been so drunk he couldn't remember. He was definitely highly intoxicated, so not a good look.
No.
Roger, at trial, he denied ever confessing to anything. He swore up and down that he never admitted to killing her and that the cops had twisted his words. He's like, yeah, our marriage was rocky. We argued, but no matter how bad things got, I would have never hurt her like that. But in the end, the jury did not believe him. So with the officer's testimony about this confession and the weight of circumstantial evidence, it was pretty, strong. So Roger was found guilty of her murder, and the judge sentenced him to 18 years of hard labor. Just like that, he went from, a grieving husband to a convicted killer. And then something kind of crazy happened. On February 8th, 1968, just a regular day in Gaffney, Bill Gibbons, who was the managing editor of the Gaffney Ledger, answered a phone call. He had just come back from lunch. Most all of the other reporters were out of the office. On the other end of the line, there was a calm, almost methodical voice, a middle-aged sounding man. He told Bill Gibbons to take out 3 sheets of paper. He said, "I've got 3 stories for you. Write down what I tell you on each sheet." And so Gibbons listened and he wrote. He wasn't sure exactly what he was going to be writing. But then the man said, "On the first sheet, write the name Nancy Christine, East Smith Street." And then the caller gave him directions to an area off of Old Chain Gang Road in Gaffney, a place known as kind of a lover's lane where teenagers would sneak off to be alone. We talked about that in our previous 2 episodes. On the second sheet, he told him to write the name Nancy Carol Paris, Chatham Avenue. He told him to go to the bridge on Ford Road and look into the water on the downhill side. Then the caller said, "On this third sheet of paper, I want you to write March 1967, Jerusalem Road, Union County, Annie Louise Dedman, Spindale, North Carolina." Yep. Annie Dedman, that's Roger's wife.
Yeah.
And then the voice on the line told him to go and get the sheriff, not to go alone.
Oh, gosh. Wow.
Yeah. So Gibbons, he called the sheriff, Julian Wright, and within 30 minutes, the sheriff, Gibbons, and Deputy Billy Bridges were on that road following, the caller's directions. They started with the closest location, which was actually on the second sheet of paper. So the bridge on Ford Road. And when Deputy Bridges leaned over the railing and looked into the water, he saw the body of Nancy Paris, just 20 years old, who had been missing for 1 day. Her body was sprawled out on the sandy bank. Her legs had been spread apart, and her head was half in the cold water of Peoples Creek. She had deep bluish, like purplish marks around her neck, and there were cigarette burns all over her back.
Oh.
Can you imagine how this reporter's there?
No,
And Sheriff Wright, how they were feeling in that moment. First of all, this scene that they're seeing, and then that phone call was not just about Nancy Paris. So they knew that there was more to come.
Yeah, and obviously that caller was setting up this big theatrical moment.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's really eerie.
Oh, yeah. Bill Gibbons, he took pictures of the body. He's a newspaper reporter, and he was taking pictures of the scene for the newspaper. Seeing that girl's naked, lifeless body, it was like a nightmare for him. The Gaffney Ledger usually covered stories, about football games, not murders, Later, he would say that he had just gotten back from lunch, and our reporter and photographer, they were both out. He said otherwise he wouldn't have even gone. He would have just sent them because he really didn't think that much of the call. He figured it was probably a prank.
Oh, at first he didn't even take it like at face value?
At first he was like, there's no way this is real. But still, he said, something nagged him and he thought, even if it's a joke, I can't.
Yeah, he did
Just
follow
ignore
up,
it.
but he wasn't planning. He wasn't really thinking he would find anything.
Right.
Wow.
Anyway, he decided, if there's even the slightest chance that the caller's telling the truth, I don't want to be the guy that brushes it off.
Sure.
So he checked into it and thank God he did. As more officers showed up, Sheriff Wright, he left 2 deputies behind over there to secure that crime scene. And then he and Gibbons set off to the second crime scene, which was the first sheet of paper that the caller had told him about, which was East Smith Street. They were following the directions the caller had given. And it's really eerie because he gave them like these it wasn't like take a left and you'll find it. It was several turns and he knew that location very well.
It was like a planned, let's send these guys out on this scavenger hunt almost.
Right.
Wow.
Exactly.
So he's playing a game with them.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. He told Gibbons, go out past the junior high school, take the road toward Chain Gang Road, go to the second bridge, take a dirt road to the right, drive up to the top of the hill, turn left, come to the edge of the woods, stop. At this point, they had a full search party that had formed. And when they got up to that last turn and started combing through that like thick brush, someone yelled out, "Oh God, here she is." They had found 14-year-old Nancy Christine Tina Reinhardt. She'd been missing for 10 days.
Oh.
She'd left her grandmother's house and hadn't been seen or heard from again. Just like Nancy Paris, Tina had deep purple bruising around her neck, cigarette burns covering her body. She had bruises on her hands, legs, and ankles, signs that she'd been physically restrained, and she had also been sexually assaulted. Worst of all, the coroner would confirm that she had only been dead for about 24 hours when her body was found.
Oh.
She'd been missing 10 days.
All that time. Oh.
She had been alive and tortured.
So he had to have kept her somewhere.
Mm-hmm. And just as that was sinking in, the sheriff's office, they get this call. Deputy Vernon Wright, he answered the call, and the caller asked if Gibbons got the sheriff to go look for the bodies, and then he hung up. So Sheriff Wright, he requested that Union County deputies check Jerusalem Road because that was, remember, the third location on that third sheet of paper, but that wasn't in their jurisdiction.
Okay.
But when they went, they didn't see anything. There was no body. They didn't really put it together at first, but it was actually that reporter that did put it together. He was like, I remember that. There's a man serving, time for this, her husband.
Yeah.
And so he put that together. But the Gaffney Ledger reported that investigators found no connection between Annie Dedman's murder back in May and these 2 brutal killings. That night, February 12th at 9:15 p.m., Bill Gibbons' home phone rang.
Okay, that's getting kind of scary.
Yes. He answered, and that same calm, eerie voice was on the other line. And this is what he said. We're going to have to do something about that man down yonder serving my sentence.
That is creepy as all get out.
Yeah. And then he said, I killed Mrs. Dedman, just like I did Mrs. Paris and Reinhardt, with all of them begging me not to.
So he's, obviously deranged, but I guess he wants to get caught? Or is he still he's just playing with
He
them?
actually said he felt sorry for her husband. That, and I think either he felt sorry for him or he didn't want him getting credit for what he did.
I know. It makes you wonder.
Remind me, I want to talk about that.
Okay.
And he didn't stop there. The caller started describing exactly what happened to Annie Dedman. He said that she was speeding in a red Ford. Her left taillight was busted when she passed him near Linder's graveyard. He said that Roger had been passed out in the car and he was following them.
That whole time when they left and they were like swerving all over the road and
yes.
stuff.
And then almost like he was reliving it or something, he just went into these disturbing details about what she was wearing, just these eerie details. But he didn't say exactly how he got her to stop the car or how he killed her. Then, almost casually, he said, I took the body to Union County to throw suspicion off Cherokee County. He also claimed that before Annie died, she mentioned a relative in law enforcement. So, and she kind of warned him and said, he's going to get you. Gibbons now, he's, trying to keep him talking. He's asking about, because he knew that Nancy Paris had been walking a dog, a little poodle, and she disappeared. And without missing a beat, he said, it's dead. It's out in the open in the exact location where I killed her.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, he's obviously a psychopath.
Yeah, he is.
But gosh.
Now, he did say that he felt sorry for her, that she was hungry, and he wished he would have just gave her something to eat. These people are so
deranged.
They're so crazy that it's hard to tell if they're playing a game with you, or if they're serious, if they're really mean what they're saying. But he said that it was almost like he had two personalities. He would stand outside of himself and watch this other person kind of take over. So it was almost like the good guy and the evil guy. And I think if that's true, I think the good in him did feel sorry for Roger Deadman. And I don't think he hated men. It was women he had a hatred for.
Yeah.
And so I think he had compassion for him.
Or something plucked his guilt in there at some point. But, oh my gosh. I mean, clearly deranged.
Right, exactly. Well, what happened, though, is that people started thinking that Gibbons was the murderer because he had all of this information.
They think he's playing the game with them.
Ooh. Yes. It was like that for a while until one day after he had been out with law enforcement. They had come back to his house with him, and he happened to call while they were there.
Oh, well, that's a relief.
Otherwise, I mean, they were thinking this is definitely got to be him.
Well, and they already have prosecuted one guy for it.
Exactly.
So it was very likely
that he would have gone down for that.
I bet he was pretty worried about that.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. On February 13th, the next morning, after that phone call in 1968, Gaffney woke up to another missing girl.
Oh.
This time it was 15-year-old Opal Diane Buxton. She was standing beside her bus stop at 7 a.m. waiting to head to school when somebody had snatched her right off the street in front of her sister.
Oh, no.
Yes. Her 16-year-old sister, Gracie, saw everything. She saw this white man forcing her sister into the trunk of his blue car.
Oh, that's horrifying.
Most of these serial type killers, they have very specific older women, or they may be blonde women, or they maybe want. So this guy has so far, he's killed a 30-something-year-old woman, a 20-something-year-old woman. He's killed a 14-year-old girl. And those three were all white women. And now this is a young black girl. Nobody's safe, right?
Right. There's no rhyme or reason other than they're just women.
Right. Now, he would later say if they're fat or ugly or men, then they're safe.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Oh.
It's just the pretty young girls that he wanted. So the sister who witnessed this, she saw him force her sister into the back of the car and froze for a second. And then they saw each other, look into each other's eyes. And Gracie turned and ran as fast as she could. And she actually was able to get away. So up until this point, the town had already been on edge, scared to death. But this is broad daylight.
Yeah, that's scary. He's brazen.
Yeah.
Again, it makes me wonder, is he wanting to get caught?
I know. Yeah. So after Opal Buxton's kidnapping, Sheriff Wright, he took charge and led this big manhunt that stretched across multiple counties there in South Carolina. They've got SLED, they've got the FBI, the Highway Patrol, sheriffs from nearby towns, and they all joined together throughout the night. And it wasn't just law enforcement. Everybody was trying to help. Two of the searchers, one was a professional golfer named Henry Transo. and a former Cherokee County warden whose name was Lester Skinner. And those two went out together because they knew the area real well, and so they just went out looking. And a few hours after the kidnapping, they spotted a 1957 Chevrolet who was back down the end of a dirt road near the Cowpens Battleground community. And there was a man who was crouched down beside the car. So Transeau and Skinner, they drove down toward him, but the minute he saw him, he jumped in his car and took off. According to the Gaffney Ledger, what happened next was kind of like something out of a high-speed thriller movie or whatever, because they chased him down the dirt roads and closed in on him. But then he pulls into this driveway and starts casually talking to another man. They really believed this was who they were looking for, but they were not going to make a move without backup, which was smart. Instead of confronting him, they wrote down his tag number and they called the cops. So the man was 31-year-old Leroy Martin. And Transeau, he just started driving by his house every chance he got. And on February 14th, there he was, standing in his driveway, washing his car like nothing had ever happened. So SLED, they'd already been on him. And the next morning, February 15th, they followed him to the textile mill where he worked. They pulled his time card and matched up his schedule with the murders.
Oh, wow.
So he had not been at work.
On everyone.
On everyone. The next morning, on February 16th at 9:40, SLED made another discovery. Opal Buxton's naked, dead body was found.
I was hoping that they would be able to catch him in time to save her.
She had been hid under some leaves, pine needles, and branches and left to rot in that same heavily wooded area where those two had spotted Martin.
Mm-hmm.
So Opal had been strangled, but she had been stabbed twice, once in the leg and once in the chest. Just a few hours later, at 12:20, Leroy Martin was officially arrested in connection with her murder. They didn't even keep him in Gaffney, not with the town on edge like they were. The moment they had him in custody, they took him to Columbia. The people in Gaffney, of course, they're relieved, but this case was far from over because now they want to know how many victims are there.
Right.
So following his arrest, he is officially charged in the strangulations of Nancy Reinhardt, Nancy Paris, and Opal Buxton. The investigators, they were trying to dig beyond that. By February 19th, law enforcement outside South Carolina had taken notice. And so there were authorities in Atlanta, Georgia. They began looking at Martin as a potential suspect in the disappearance in 1965 of Mary Shotwell Little, who had disappeared from a shopping center parking lot. But it never really led to anything concrete, but they still suspect that it was him. February 21st, the Gaffney Ledger published this article after Annie Dedman's family spoke out because they still believe that Roger was responsible for her murder.
They do?
Yeah.
But the other guy did take credit.
He did.
And it was very similar.
It was. But her father claimed that on the night of her death, Annie had planned to leave Roger on Highway 18, but instead Roger ran and shoved her over and, got into the car with her, which I think that was true whenever they were at that bar. Her mother doubled down, and said he even told my brother that he thought he did it.
Yeah, he confessed, but he was so drunk he wasn't really sure.
Exactly. But finally, piece by piece, the evidence just kept piling up, and investigators recovered clothes, personal belongings from the victims, and the body of that little poodle that Nancy Paris had been walking the night she was kidnapped. But then investigators followed remember that dead end dirt road where Martin's car had been seen after the abduction? Well, they found an abandoned house there.
Oh.
And a well. When they emptied that well, they pulled out Opal Buxton's jacket, one of her shoes, the very clothes that she'd been wearing that day when she was taken. There was no doubt anymore I mean, they didn't really ever have any doubt, but they knew that this was their guy. Because he's saying, I didn't do it. You know, he's playing dumb.
So, and the other girl that he kept for all those days before, like, that's probably where she was kept too.
Oh, yeah. There was enough evidence, and they knew that he was also Annie Dedman's killer. They found physical evidence tying him to that.
I'm sure Roger was relieved to find that out.
Yes. There were other things, like there was a distance in between where Roger Dedman lived, and it was really kind of impossible for him to have done it because there was a witness placing him at his home at a certain time. Actually, there was a witness placing him at his home at, I think, like 1 a.m. They knew that she had been murdered after that. There was just no way, really, that he could have done it. But he was their best suspect.
Yeah. See, stuff like that does make me wonder how many times that does happen. Somebody, that it just looks so overwhelmingly obvious that you don't take into account or see fully, well, this really couldn't have been done. Somebody's in prison for it. We know that happens.
Sure.
But then this particular case, somebody gets caught. But a lot of times there are people out there getting away with murder because somebody else is doing time for something they've done. And that's kind of scary to think about.
It really makes me leery to want to jump on bandwagons.
Yes.
Unless we know. Circumstantial evidence just sometimes isn't enough.
I know.
Roger Dedman, they realized, was an innocent man. And after spending nearly a year behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, he was officially released from prison on February 29th in 1968. He got to go home to his toddler son. Finally, the guy admitted it.
Okay.
So he just cried and cried because he's, everybody's thinking he's a murderer.
Right.
I'm sure that no amount of time is going to erase what all he lost in those months.
Oh, no. But thankfully, he didn't spend 20 years behind.
I'm so thankful.
It was a short-lived time, as not to him, I'm sure, but in the grand scheme of things.
Oh, yeah. I can't imagine somebody accusing you of that and you wanting to grieve your wife because no matter what, no matter how volatile their relationship was, they loved each other. They wouldn't have been together.
Yeah.
He loved her. She
loved
loved
a child
him.
together.
They had a child together. And so you're so sad about that.
Yeah.
But you're having to spend all of your energy like defending yourself.
Yeah.
Later, though, he was fully exonerated. The man dubbed the Gaffney Strangler was sentenced to 4 life sentences, 1 for each of his victims. Thank God.
Yeah.
There was never a chance of parole, no possibility of freedom. Justice, had finally been served. But I'm sure for the families of Annie Dedman, Nancy Reinhart, Nancy Paris, and Opal Buxton, there was no sentence that was going to undo that kind of pain. While serving out his 4 life sentences at Central Correctional Institution in Columbia, Martin was stabbed to death by another inmate, Kenneth Marshall Rumsey. The next day, on June 1st in 1972, the Greensville News reported his murder. Not one tear was shed. After 4 years of terrorizing innocent women, he died the same way he lived.
Yep. Wow.
Any questions or anything?
Well, I talked a lot during the episode.
No, I didn't think you talked. In fact, I was thinking, talk.
Yeah. He's the epitome of a serial killer. I mean, just that toying with the authorities, the fact that he called it in, the fact that he felt guilty at some point, but then he didn't, and he confessed, and then he denied the confession, and then he finally admitted it. Just all of those things. I mean, based on, movies we see about serial killers, they all just, it does seem to be a little bit of a pattern.
Right.
But a creepy, scary pattern nonetheless.
Oh my gosh.
And you think this was back in the 60s. You don't really think about serial killers being alive and well in the 60s.
Right.
But there is nothing new under the sun.
That's the truth. That is the truth. Evil is in every part of history.
Mm-hmm. In every walk of life.
Right. He fully confessed to everything and told his mother and other people that he had a split personality, that he just felt like he was not himself whenever those things happened. Not an excuse, but I'm just saying, I don't know. I just can't believe that's mental illness. I just believe it's demonic.
It is demonic. I agree. He says he had these, split personality. Did nobody ever up until that point notice that? How do you hide that going through life? That's what scares me.
Oh, he was a married father.
Oh, wait, what?
Yeah, this wasn't like some single man. Yeah.
Oh, I was, honestly, in my mind, I've been picturing this, old 40, 50-year-old white geezer man.
31. 31-year-old textile mill worker who had a wife and children and was a serial killer.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, those were some hard times.
Yes, they were.
Before we get into today's story, let's take a detour to Gaffney, South Carolina, back in the 1960s. Back then, the hum of the textile mills still filled the air, and folks worked long shifts under looms and spindles. Mill life was tough, long hours, low wages, and a meal might be nothing more than some potted meat and crackers at lunch, with beans and fatback for supper. But even in the hardest times, folks found ways to sweeten life just a little, and that's where sweet potato pone came in. Grated sweet potatoes, molasses, warm spices, and baked up just right. It was a dish that reminded folks there was still a little good to be had, even when times were tough. But Gaffney in the 60s wasn't just a town of mill workers and home-cooked meals. It was a place on the edge of change. Civil rights were reshaping the South. Rock and roll was taking over the jukeboxes, and teenagers were drag racing down Limestone Street while their parents were sipping coffee in the cafe. But beneath all that, there was something dark happening that folks wouldn't forget, no matter how hard they tried. Just like that sweet potato poon, today's story has layers. Something warm, something dark, and by the end, it'll leave you with something to chew on. So settle in.